Howdy. Welcome back to Dion Talk. I'm going to talk for a few minutes on the subject of debt, all things debt. About 10 years ago, maybe a little more now, 11 years, I decided to take control of my personal finances. I had made it to the age of 40 without ever having $1,000 in the bank. I think most of us have this day where we wake up and we realize that you have more control over your finances than you think you do. And for me, it was 40. I hated debt. At that point in time, I was a single parent with 3 kids. I had been laid off from a police department and had started working at a truck driving school teaching people how to drive trucks, making about $17 an hour. During my divorce, just before getting laid off from the police department, I found out about a couple $100,000 in debt in my name that I didn't know existed until the divorce. And I live in Washington State, which is a community property state. So the debt was our debt. Doesn't matter if you know about it or not. It's not fraud if you're married. And after the divorce, she filed for bankruptcy. So our debt became my debt. Wasn't making a lot of money. Had custody of 3 kids. And all of a sudden found out about a bunch of bad debt. Not a good position to start from. And so that anybody doesn't get depressed, it took about 10 years to not only reach financial freedom, but reach a positive net worth of over a couple million and get rid of all the bad debt. And ironically, what helped me get rid of the debt was more debt. And if you find that you're in a lot of debt, here's something that I did that actually helped. I found out about a couple $100,000 in debt, mostly credit cards, a couple personal loans, an apartment complex where we had rented an apartment that I didn't know about for over a year. That's fun. And a dentist bill and a couple of other things. And I was on the phone with one of the collectors who had, I found out my ex had filed bankruptcy, and he asked me if my plan was to file bankruptcy too, because if I had intended to file for bankruptcy, that they would take about 20 to 25% of what was owed and forgive the rest, as long as I didn't include the amount in a bankruptcy, which I didn't know was a thing. And at the time, I was working in law enforcement, and bankruptcy is not really an option because it's kind of a career killer. If you have financial problems, you're more likely to take a bribe. So I wasn't even thinking bankruptcy. It wasn't an option. But I contacted every single of the debtors, the people who I now magically found out I owed money to. And almost all of them reduced the amount that they would take as long as I didn't name them in a bankruptcy. The dentist, the apartment complex, and the Discovery card wouldn't budge. Their amount stayed the same. Pretty much everybody else lowered their amount from a couple of $100,000 in debt to about $89,000. That's what I ended up having to take care of. So, single parent with 3 kids making $17 an hour, $89,000 in bad debt is a lot of bad debt. Even though it's a reduced amount, it still sucked. So at that point in time, I hated debt. My brother had reached financial freedom by buying rental properties. He had a paid off home, and he took out a home equity line of credit, used that money to buy a rental property, usually a falling down mobile home in the middle of nowhere on acreage that he would then, he has craftsman skills. He would turn it into a really good rental. He would focus on all of his income until he paid off the home equity line of credit because he didn't like debt either. He was using the debt from the house to acquire the assets, but then he would focus all the cash flow to get rid of the debt. He's never carried a mortgage. He's always paid cash or used his home equity line of credit to buy his rentals. The first time that I had a conversation with him and I said, hey, I'm thinking about buying rentals and I'm going to be using mortgages, he actually called me stupid, which is normal in our family. It's a term of endearment to call me lazy or stupid. I was stupid for joining the military. I was stupid for becoming a cop. I was stupid for getting married. So, well, they're batting 1,000 actually. So I didn't have a paid off house. I couldn't take out a home equity line of credit. I wasn't making enough money to save up money and buy something in all cash. So before we get into debt, I want to talk about Dave Ramsey, who talks about his 7 steps and how much he hates debt. So the first step is great. Save $1,000. Pretty much everybody would benefit from having $1,000 saved in the bank because the statistic from a study was 40% of people in the United States can't handle a $400 expense without going into debt, using a credit card or having to borrow money. So I agree with that. The rest of the steps kind of lose it for me as an investor. And I get, if you're a Dave Ramsey follower, a lot of people have benefited from him. And if you don't have an investing strategy that is going to use debt, most of his steps work for everybody. But if I had used his strategy, I would still have to work for probably another 20 years instead of being bad debt free now. And work has been completely optional since 2018. So it took me about 8 years to make work because I was using debt. And if we went back to when I first found out about the bad debt, the last thing I would have ever said in my life was, I wish I had more debt, but I do. Right now, I wish I had more debt. I just wish I had the right kind. In Dave Ramsey's teachings, he talks about the debt snowball. And it's actually the method that I used before I knew that it had a name or it was a thing. And this is where you pick your smallest debt. And I used a version of this. You pick your smallest debt and focus on it to pay it off quickly. So you get the dopamine hit of taking care of a debt. You take the payment that debt had and any extra money that you had, and you put it on your next smallest debt. So I used a version of that. The debt avalanche is when you pick your highest interest rate and you focus to pay that off first, because mathematically that makes the most sense. So for me, what I was focusing on in the beginning was a bit of both. I looked at interest on debt. If I had bad debt, so the credit cards, the personal loans, the things that were in my name that I didn't know about, and I looked at the highest interest rates, anything that was at 6% or higher, I focused on to pay off. So it's kind of using the debt avalanche method because I was going for the highest interest rates first, but I used both because I took all of the debts that were above 6% and I looked at the smallest valued debt above 6% interest and focused to pay that off first. My mentality was, if I have a debt that has more than 6% interest on it and I pay that down, that is like getting a 6% return on my money because I'm not going to be paying that amount of interest. When I look at investing, the path that I saw for investing, and I used buy and hold, small multifamily, and house hacking. I've house hacked twice, and I'll cover what that is if it's your first time to my channel. I used house hacking to reduce or eliminate my housing expense so that I can speed up the ability to pay off the debt and the ability to save for the next investment. When I invest in a rental property, my return first year is 10% or better. So if I can take my money and invest in a rental property and get a return, that return can be used to pay off debts. And in my mind, if it was 6% or lower, it made more sense to acquire an asset that paid me more than the debt costs on the asset so that I can use that cash flow to pay off the bad debt. Understanding that there is good debt and bad debt is the mental shift that most of us take when we read the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. He's got probably 18 books now, 2 that I recommend to everybody. The rest, if it fits your strategy or not, you can go for it. But the first one is Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and that's where we realize the difference between assets and liabilities. And it kind of covers good debt versus bad debt. And then after I cover good debt and bad debt, I also want to cover weird debt. And so once I cover that, let me know if you've heard about weird debt before too. Because there's debt that's not really good or bad, it's just weird. If you buy a car or you have consumer debt, credit cards, personal loans, payday loans, things where you are borrowing money to buy things that aren't going to make you money. The house that you live in, if you buy a primary house that is, you're not going to rent out the rooms. You might have an asset when you sell it and you might profit from it, but while you're living in it, it costs you money. To me, these are all forms of bad debt. There is a benefit to owning a house. So even if you're not an investor, I would still recommend being a homeowner over being a renter in most cases. But if you buy a rental property, or if you borrow money to start a business and that business generates more money than the debt causes, or if you use margin when you're investing in stocks, it is possible to generate money from debt. So there's bad debt, which is the consumer debt, and then good debt is debt that makes you more money than the debt costs. And in my case, bad debt or good debt is when somebody else pays off the balance. On a rental property, a part of the mortgage payment that you make every month that you make with the rent money pays down the principal. So understanding good debt and bad debt is one of the first steps, and then figuring out how to get good debt. I had a bad debt to income ratio. I had a lot of debt. I wasn't making a lot of money. So I couldn't just go out and buy a rental property. In order to do that, to get around that hurdle, I moved from my house into an apartment and rented out the house for 2 years to get rental income on my tax returns. After 2 years, lenders were able to look at the rental income of the duplex I was looking at in my debt to income ratio so that I could buy a property, even though I still wasn't making a lot of money and still had a bad debt to income ratio. When I moved into the duplex, that created almost $300,000 more debt than I had. Remember, I had $89,000 in bad debt, and I paid off some over those 2 years. I was saving at the same time. About half of what you would call extra money that wasn't being spent on living expenses went to pay off everything that was over 6% interest, and half went into a savings account so that I can get into a house hack because I wanted to reduce or eliminate my housing costs, which is for most of us our biggest expense. So that was my focus. While I still had bad debt, I was saving for that first investment. I moved into the duplex. It was about $300,000. There's closing costs and some very small immediate repairs. I buy places that are either rent ready or already occupied. So I'm not doing rehabs. I'm not doing the burr method. I'm not doing a lot of work. I move into the duplex and I go from the debt on the house and the $89,000 in bad debt. I add almost $300,000 in debt because I use a 5% down owner occupied loan. So I had saved up about $20,000, which meant that I needed $15,000 for the down because it was 5% of $300,000 would be $15,000. And then there was closing costs, the appraisal, the inspection, those kind of things. And some of that was covered by the seller. This was before it became a seller's market, and sellers were covering some of the closing costs. You have to have reserves too. So that's an amount of money that you'll need to save if you go to buy an investment property or a house hack or even a home that you live in. And at the time, what I did is I had some money in a retirement account, which I have since emptied because I have a list of reasons why I don't want any money in a retirement account. But at the time, lenders would use 50% of the money in a retirement account, and you don't have to take it out or tap it or anything, but they'll take 50% of that and count it as a reserve. So that's how I got the duplex. I created $300,000 in debt, basically it's $285,000 or so, in order to reduce what I was paying for housing. In the apartment, my housing cost was $1,500 a month. When I moved into the duplex and the other side was rented out, I was paying about $300 a month. So that meant I was able to save, to invest, or to pay down the bad debt, an extra $1,200 a month because I created $285,000 in debt, which is good debt because the other side was rented out. And now I'm house hacking another place. So that first duplex, both sides are rented out. It's profiting over $1,000 a month now. And each month, the tenants that pay me the rent, I take the $1,000 that's profit. I set aside money for repairs and vacancy and maintenance. And a portion of that covers principal pay down. So every month, that place is appreciating in value, being worth more. The tenants are paying down the mortgage. So the gap between what I owe and what it's worth keeps growing. That's kind of like a savings account that keeps growing every month without me having to actively put money into it. Because I created debt, I have more money. It was $14,000, a little more than $14,000 a year added to my ability to save because I took on extra debt. I repeated this. The next one took about 2 years to save for. The next one took a little less than 2 years because this thing called the income snowball starts to kick in. When you have cash flowing assets that are producing more cash than the debt expense that you have on them, that all starts to add together. And you start making money fast enough to where the time between purchases gets a lot shorter. Michael Zuber from One Rental at a Time and Matt, the Lumberjack Landlord, often talk about recycling capital. So they get that gap really big and then they do a cash out refinance or take out a home equity line of credit, or they've sold properties to reinvest in something else and do a 1031 exchange. I have not done that. The way that I recycle capital is I did not let my life creep increase. I didn't get a nicer car in the first few years. I didn't start taking vacations. I didn't do all the things that I could now afford to do. I didn't just start doing. I recycled the cash flow. Every penny that came in from my rental profit in the beginning went into a savings account. And then there became this inflection point where the rental profit became more than my living expenses. So at that point in time, I took the rental money to pay for my life. So 100% of my W-2 income became a savings amount. And now it's about 65% of rental income and 100% of, so every penny that I've made from work goes into my saving for the next investment category. And about 65% of rental profit goes into that account too. That income snowball starts to kick in and you save quicker and faster to do what I'm hoping to. I'm hoping that this year I can create at least another $1 million in debt on purpose. Because as I invest, the more debt that I have, the more cash flow I generate. My net worth is increasing with each property that I purchase. So there's a couple fundamentals that I want to do too. Figuring out if you want to invest or pay off debt. To me, it's the interest rate. If you have a low interest rate debt, like most of our mortgages now, if people have either purchased in the last 2 or 3 years or refinanced because rates drop so low, it doesn't make sense to pay off a low interest debt. So one of Dave Ramsey's steps, and I forget his order of his steps. So first it's save $1,000, and then it's pay off all debt except for your house, which I guess if the debt was considered a high interest rate, I'm on board with that. Then you want to save 3 to 6 months of emergency funds, which I agree with. So 2 of the first 3 steps I agree with 100%. Then he says to invest 15% of household income to a retirement account. So I've got a list of reasons why I don't want any money in a retirement account. If you don't have any form of investing that generates cash flow, and a retirement account might be a good idea. But in my case, since my goal is to generate cash flow, there's no reason for me to have money in a retirement account other than investing for the match from an employer in a 401k or a simple plan. But even that's money that's trapped away, that's not paying me now. It's not giving me cash flow to save or invest. It's not gaining me 4 times the amount that I've invested in appreciation because I've used leveraged on a rental property. It's not getting me principal pay down. And the tax benefits of a retirement account are terrible when you compare them to the tax benefits of real estate. So after saving the 15%, Dave Ramsey says to save for kids' college. And for me, if you want your kids to go to college, there are a couple of paths to take. First, saving for college or a trade school kind of goes into the same bucket. There are some accounts that you can save for that. I really like what Brandon Turner from BiggerPockets did. And to save for his kids' college or vocational school or investing, when the kid was born, when his daughter Rose was born, he purchased a fourplex in Aberdeen, Washington. The place cash flows about $1,000 a month. So he buys an asset that he cash flows from, but he buys it on a 15-year note. So when that kid turns 15, that property is paid off. Before the kid turns 18, he will do a cash out refinance, take out the value because the property's paid off and it will have appreciated over that time. That cash out refinance to 75 or 80%, it's a loan to value, will be the amount of money that his daughter either gets to take for college, a trade school, or to invest in real estate, or whatever the goal for that person would be. Even after he does the cash out refinance, he is still going to own an asset that cash flows. So if you have young kids right now, Jeremy Kirkwood, who's been on my channel, actually names each one of his properties after one of his 8 kids, so that at some point those kids will either inherit. I don't know if he's going to inherit the property or the cash out refinance money or whatever his strategy is, but there is a way to save for your kids' future by using debt to invest in real estate. And then the last thing in the Dave Ramsey steps is to build wealth so you can help other people, which I agree with. So what is that? 3 out of 7 rules I'm 100% on board with. My only problem with Dave Ramsey, and if you support Dave Ramsey, I totally get it. Feel free to attack me in the comments, is he never points out that he went bankrupt and lost everything because he was using 90-day debt. He swears debt is terrible and you should buy houses in cash and you should pay off your mortgage. And if you're making $10 million a year because you have a radio show that's syndicated, sure, that makes sense. But for the average mortal, that's not the best option sometimes. So how much debt would be too much debt? Most of us are old enough to remember 2008, there was a housing crash and debt was a major issue. So in my opinion, the amount of debt is not the problem. It's the percentage, the ratio of debt. If you have assets worth a certain amount of money and they are leveraged 100% or more, you are set up for failure. In 2008, not only did people have ninja loans, no income, no job, no assets, they could just go into a bank and say, I make $400,000 a year, and the bank would lend them money. People had adjustable rate mortgages. We don't have those now. But even worse, people were borrowing 105% of the loan of the. I did this. My house that I purchased before 2008, it was like $98,000, and we borrowed $104,000 because that $4,000 or that $6,000 above the purchase price covered the closing costs. So we had negative equity day one owning that house, and as long as prices went up, great. Because then if the interest rates went up, you could refinance, and prices don't always go up. In 2008, people lost appreciation, lost the principal pay down. Those two things can disappear when prices go down. And if that happens when your interest rate goes up and you're underwater on your house, so you can't refinance, you can't sell, and people weren't doing 105 LTV loans anymore, they started doing 75 and 80 because that's where they should be. So over leveraged is what happens when you have too much debt. It's not that the amount is too much, it's that the amount compared to the value of your assets. So in my case, my goal is to maintain about a 70% loan to value. If I had assets that were worth $100,000 total, I would want a $70,000 mortgage so that I have some equity. I can handle a dip in the prices. I can handle problems if I had to sell and get out without creating more debt for myself. But I have enough leverage on an asset to where I didn't have to put $100,000 down to control a $100,000 asset. I have $30,000 in equity to control a $100,000 asset. So if I have $30,000 invested into a property, it's worth $100,000, and it goes up 10%. I don't gain 10% on my 30,000. I gain 10% on the 100,000. So that's why with my portfolio across the board, I want to maintain at least 70% loan to value. I'm around 55% right now. So on my next purchase, I've never used my VA loan. I was in the Marine Corps. I have access to a VA loan. I've never used it because since I've become an investor, I want to maintain an equity position. So when I buy a property, I want to put down a down payment. I did the 5% down on the duplex, but since then, all of my down payments have been 20 or 25%. So I have a better equity position to start. But right now, with the appreciation of the properties and the principal pay down across my mortgages, I have such a high equity position that if I purchased my next property with zero down on a VA loan, I would still be over 70% loan to value on the whole portfolio. So I don't look at each asset by itself. I would look at the whole picture. So that's what I consider too much debt is over leveraged, and that's the percentage that I keep. One of the problems that people can run into if you pay off your mortgages, if you focus and pay them off, which I did one time, and I can explain why if anybody's curious, but my plan going forward is not to pay any off until I get at least 10 mortgages in my name. Right now, I have 6. I own 7 properties, 6 mortgages. 6 of them have mortgages on them. If you pay off the mortgage, at some point, you will not have enough depreciation or write-offs to where you might have a tax obligation on your rental profit, which is not technically a bad thing. Never pay interest to avoid taxes. Like, don't create debt so that you don't pay taxes, because the cost of the debt would be more than the tax benefit. When you buy something, take advantage of the tax benefits. So I think people say, don't let the tax tail wag the dog. If you have the opportunity to take advantage of write-offs and depreciation and things like interest on a loan, you take advantage of it. So I'm not going to create debt on my properties just so I can have tax benefits. I might do a cash out refinance or take out a home equity line of credit to buy another asset, but it's not for the tax benefits. It's just tax benefits are something that I would take advantage of. So in this instance, understanding yourself is the first step. Do you have the discipline to not create bad debt? Not get a high interest car loan or buy more car than you should or buy more primary residence than you need until you have the cash flow from assets to pay for it. can you use a credit card and I buy absolutely everything I can on that credit card because it has cash back. I want that cash back reward. I've never carried a balance on the credit card though. If you there was a myth from the 80s or 90s. I mean, the FICO score was proposed like in the 60s, and in the 1989 it finally became the credit score system came out. So there's a myth from the 80s or 90s where people said if you carry a small balance from one month to the next, it helps your credit score, which is not true. Making sure you use less than 10% of your available credit has a positive impact to your score, but carrying a balance does not. So I pay my credit card off every day to make sure that I never have that negative impact. And my credit score is not great. It's about 800. So there are people with higher credit scores. So if you have another channel that you watch where they teach you how to do credit scores, great. My goal is to keep it at 740 or higher, because when you're getting mortgages on rental properties, there's no difference to the lender between a 750 and an 850. Anything above 740 gets you the best rates. So my goal is to keep it, and it fluctuates every time I buy a mortgage or something, or get a mortgage. It drops my score down to 780, and then 2 or 3 months later, it's back up to around 800. So if you don't have the discipline to use a credit card and pay it off to where you never carry a balance, then maybe a credit card is not the best option for you.